I like to tell you a story that comes from Italy in the 16th century by Giambattista Basile. Once upon a time, there was a very happy couple. The husband, Giannuccio, his wife, and two beautiful children, Nennillo and Nennella. Nennillo was a strong boy. He helped his father with the chores, and Nennella helped her mother. But as he's away, tragedy struck the family, and the mother died, leaving the three of them to grieve. Giannuccio thought he should find at least a governess for his children, even better, a new mother, a wife. So he went out and he found himself a new wife. His wife was very attractive and she had plenty of money. But the moment she walked in the door and saw the two children, she was furious. I did not marry to become someone's servant. I will not be their mother of these brats. And so she convinced Giannuccio to get rid of the children. He fought her on it for quite a long time because he loved them more than life itself. But she was persistent. And in some way, he loved his new wife. Giannuccio picked up a basket, packed it full of food, and took each child by the hand, went into the forest, deeper and deeper, until he found a clearing where he sat them down and he said, I will leave you here, children. You have food aplenty, but if you should need to find your way home, I have left pebbles on the path that wind the way through the forest. Follow the pebbles and return home. He kissed each child on the head, turned, wiping a tear from his face. The children held each other tight. And once the dark set in, the noises of the forest came alive. But because it was a full moon, they looked out and saw the pebbles glinting in the moonlight and followed them home. Their father was overjoyed to see them, but their stepmother, I will not have these brats in my home. Take them, get rid of them, or I will leave. Giannuccio knew that he didn't have a choice, or did he? The next day, he took a basket full of food, grabbed each child by the hand and walked them deep into the forest. He sat them down in a different place, a different clearing. And he said, please, stay here. For in the forest, the trees will look after you, they will shelter you. The water will nourish you, and the earth will support you with its soft bed. But if you need to come home, I have left a trail of bran all the way back to the cottage. He kissed each child on the forehead and returned home weeping. He didn't want his children to see him crying. The children stayed into the night, and the next day, and soon their food ran out. Because when they went to find the path through the forest that their father had left, the bran had been nibbled up by the birds. So they ate acorns and chestnuts. They drank from their hands by the river. And they got hungrier and hungrier and did not know the way out of the forest. Now it so happened that where they lived, was in a kingdom. And one day the children heard the barking of hounds, hunting dogs. Hunting dogs wove through the forest And Nennillo put his hands over his ears. He couldn't stand the noise, and he ran and he hid in the trunk of a tree, in the bark, big hole. Put his hands over his head and rocked and hoped the noise would go away. And Nennella, she ran. She ran as fast as she could through the forest, running blindly in any direction she could away from where the hounds were. And suddenly she landed on a beach, her feet in the sand. And she looked around, and all across the beach were ships. There were men there restocking. And on one of those ships was a man who was a pirate. He saw Nennella and took her with him back to his wife, for they had just recently lost a child about her age, and they made her their own daughter. Nennella went to sea with pirates. Meantime, back in the forest, Nennillo, still rocking and waited for the barking to stop, but it didn't. Soon the dogs surrounded him, and a man on a horse stepped down in front of him and invited him to come with them. He could only remember his name. He couldn't remember anything else to tell the prince. And so he went the prince back to his palace, where the prince arranged for him to get an apprenticeship, and he trained to make the most beautiful knives, sharpened, wooden-handled, beautiful knives. And he could cut things down to a very fine edge. And time passed. Nennella with the pirates, Nennillo with the prince, and soon he and the prince became good companions. Now, the life of a pirate isn't easy, and Nennella didn't partake in any of the piracy. But one day, a big storm blew up, and the ships that they were on were all upturned, and everyone died except Nennella. Some say it's because she was good. But in the water, a great fish came up, an enchanted fish, and swallowed her. Nennella thought her time was up. She opened her eyes, thinking that was it. And she saw, spread all around her, the most wondrous scene. A great forest, a marvellous castle, and food and plenty all around. Nennella was in heaven. Time passed. Nennillo was out on the balcony at the prince's castle, and the balcony looked over the sea. The enchanted fish came up near where the prince was and opened its mouth. Nennella saw her brother standing on the balcony carving with his knife. "Brother, brother," she called. "Brother, I am here." He shook his head. He didn't know what that was about. "Brother, brother, I am here." Soon the prince became curious and asked all of his attendants who had a sister. Did anyone have a sister? For her voice was so sweet. Nennillo thought for a moment and said, I think I had a sister. I'm not sure, but I think I had a sister. "Brother, brother," she called again. Nennillo looked down into the giant magical fish's mouth and put out his hand. And Nennella put her hand in his. She came out of the mouth looking like a nymph, glorious in this wonderful scene. She was reunited with her brother, and he remembered. He remembered her. He remembered his father and their awful stepmother and their mother who had died. they told the prince about what had happened and how their father had been convinced to leave them in the forest. So the prince put out a proclamation for anyone who had missing 2 children, Nennillo and Nennella, to come forth to claim. He had news of them. Giannuccio came forward, rushing to the prince. "My children, where are they?" But the prince had questions. "How is it that you let someone convince you that you should let go of your beautiful, beautiful children? What were you thinking?" Giannuccio shook his head. He was ashamed of what he'd done. And he had grieved them, for he thought wolves had taken them in the night. Soon the prince invited Nennillo and Nennella to come out, and they were reunited with their father, who did not let him out of his embrace for ages. The prince then gave Giannuccio a fine vest and asked the children to hide, and invited Giannuccio's wife, the stepmother, to the palace, where he brought out the 2 children and asked her, "What would you do if someone had gotten rid of these children in the forest? What would you do to that person?" And the wife said, "Well, I would lock them in a barrel and roll them down a hill." "Very well," said the prince, "you have decided your fate." And that was the fate of the stepmother, unfortunately. But now that Giannuccio had his children back, they lived happily ever after.